All right. Let's get right into it. Transcendental Dialectic, Book 1 of the Concepts of Pure Reason. Whatever may be the case with respect to the possibility of concepts of pure reason, it is certain that they are not simply obtained by reflection, but by inference. Concepts of the understanding are thought a priori, antecedently to experience, and for the purpose of it, but they contain nothing but the unity of reflection upon appearances, insofar as these appearances are to belong necessarily to a possible empirical consciousness. It is through them alone that knowledge and determination of an object become possible. Concepts of the understanding are what first supplies material for inferences, and they are not preceded by any a priori concepts of objects which they could themselves be inferred. Their objective reality, on the contrary, is founded on the fact that since they constitute the intellectual form of all experience, their application must always allow of being shown in experience. Okay, but the very title, Concept of Reason, already indicates that it does not allow of being confined within experience. Did I say concept of experience? It's concept of reason. I can't remember. I'm going to reread that. But the very title, the concept of reason, already indicates that it does not allow of being confined within experience, because it concerns a kind of knowledge which any empirical knowledge, perhaps even the whole of possible experience or of its empirical synthesis, is only part. And although an actual experience can never fully attain that knowledge, yet every actual experience belongs to it. Concepts of reason serve for comprehending. Concepts of the understanding serve for understanding. Okay, so we use reason to comprehend things, and we use the understanding for understanding. Okay, namely perceptions. If concepts of reason contain the unconditioned, they concern something to which all experience is subject, but which itself can never be an object of experience, something to which reason leads in its inference from experience, and by which it estimates engages the degree of its own empirical use, but which never is itself a member of the empirical synthesis. And I think what he's saying is like some sort of like larger scale ideas are probably, not necessarily, like they're too general to be found in actual experience, and so they can be used to tell us maybe concepts and used for reasoning and judgment, but they're not necessarily going to be found in experience and used when we're synthesizing experience through the understanding, I think. But this is pretty it's pretty vague. I don't know. If nonetheless such concepts possess objective validity, they may be called conceptius ratiocinati, concepts correctly inferred. If, however, they have no such validity, then they have only been surreptitiously obtained by a kind of illusory inference, and may be called conceptioni ratiocinantes, sophistical concepts. But as this matter can only be fully treated in the chapter on the dialectical inferences of pure reason, we shall say no more about it now. Meanwhile, just as we gave the name of categories to the pure concepts of the understanding, we shall only give a new name to the concepts of pure reason, and call them transcendental ideas. Okay, concepts of the pure reason, okay. A name that has now to be explained and justified. Okay, so transcendental ideas. All right. Bring it on, Kant. Transcendental Dialectic, Book 1, Section 1, of Ideas in General. Hold on. Sorry. Okay. Transcendental Dialectic, Book 1, Section 1, of Ideas in General. In spite of the great wealth of our languages, a thoughtful mind is often at a loss for an expression that would exactly fit his concept. You tell me. Okay, and for want of which he cannot make himself really intelligible to others, even to himself. To coin new words is to arrogate to oneself legislative powers in matters of language, which is rarely successful. Yeah. So before, it's funny, like ordinary people coining, like trying to start new words. So before taking so desperate a step, it is always advisable to look in a dead and learned language to see whether it might not contain such a concept and its appropriate expression. Even if it should happen that the original meaning of the word had become somewhat uncertain through carelessness on the part of its authors, yet it is better to acknowledge the meaning that principally belonged to it, even if it should remain doubtful whether it was originally used with exactly the meaning in mind, than to spoil our labor by making ourselves unintelligible. Okay, what are you talking about, Kant? Whenever, therefore, there exists only a single word for a certain concept, which, in its established meaning, exactly fits this concept, and when it is of great consequence to keep that concept distinct from other related concepts, then we should not use it lavishly, nor use it as a synonym in place of others, only for the sake of variety, but should carefully preserve its own particular meaning, for otherwise it may easily happen that the expression ceases to attract special attention, and gets lost in a crowd of other words of very different meaning, so that the thought, which that expression alone could have preserved, is lost with it. From the way in which Plato uses the term idea, I think this is important, idea, it is easy to see that he meant by it something which not only was never borrowed from the senses, but which even far surpasses the concepts of the understanding. Even far surpasses the with which Aristotle occupied himself, inasmuch as nothing is ever met with in experience that is congruent with it. Whoops. For Plato, the ideas are archetypes of things themselves, not merely, like the categories, keys to possible experiences. In his opinion, they flowed from the highest reason, and from this source have come to be shared by human reason. Human reason, however, no longer exists in its original state, but has to laboriously recall the old and new, very obscured ideas, which it does by a process of recollection called philosophy. This idea that I like, Plato, I think, I don't remember where, in what dialogue or whatever I read it, but like, effectively seems to pretty sincerely believe, well, I don't know, that I shouldn't ascribe beliefs to Plato based on the dialogues, but like, it seemed like they may have thought, and it wasn't crazy to think like all learning was just remembering things like your soul forgot, which is a very sweet idea, but also like it's that I'm not, I don't know about that. Anyway, I shall not enter here on any literary discussion in order to determine the exact meaning which the sublime philosopher himself connected with this expression. I shall only remark that it is by no means unusual in ordinary conversations as well as in written works that by carefully comparing the thoughts uttered by an author on his own subject matter, we succeed in understanding him better than he understood himself, because he did not sufficiently determine his concept, and thus not only spoke, but sometimes even thought, in opposition to his own intentions. Plato knew very well that our faculty of knowledge was filled with a much higher craving than merely to spell out appearances, according to synthetic unity. Okay, Plato knew very well that our faculty of knowledge was filled with a much higher craving than merely to spell out appearances, according to synthetic unity. This is using very Kantian language to talk about what Plato thought. But, okay. And thus to be able to read them as experience. He knew that our reason, if left to itself, tries to soar upward towards knowledge, with which no object that experience may give can ever be congruent, but which nevertheless is real and is by no means a mere figment of the mind. Plato discovered his ideas principally in what is practical, that is, in what rests on freedom, which in turn belongs to a class of knowledge that is a product peculiar to reason. Sorry, what? Plato discovered his ideas principally in what is practical, that is, in what rests on freedom, which in turn belongs to a class of knowledge that is a product peculiar to reason. Okay. Whoever would derive the concept of virtue from experience and change, as many have actually done, what at best can serve as an example for an imperfect illustration into a model of a source of knowledge, would indeed transform virtue into an equivocal phantom which changes according to time and circumstances, and is utterly useless as a rule. Not Plato. Because I assume the forms is like antithetical to that. Is it the point he's making, I think? Everybody can surely perceive that if a person is held up to us as a model of virtue, we have always in our own mind the true original with which we compare this alleged model, and estimate it accordingly. The true original is the idea of virtue. Okay. The true original is the idea of virtue. In regard, and is he like meaning the form, like Platonic form? Okay, the true original is the idea of virtue in regard to which all possible objects of experience may serve as examples. That is, proofs of feasibility, to a certain degree, of that which is required by the concept of reason, but never as archetypes. That no person can ever act up to what is contained in the pure idea of virtue does not in the least prove the chimerical nature of this concept. For any judgment about moral worth, I can't believe he hasn't used the fucking word forms. Is that what he's talking about? Like a... okay. That no person can ever act up to what is contained in the pure idea of virtue does not in the least prove the chimerical nature of this concept, for any judgment about moral worth, or its opposite, is still only possible by means of this idea. This idea, therefore, forms the necessary foundation for any approach to moral perfection. However far the impediments inherent in human nature, the degree of which it is difficult to determine, may keep us removed from it. Plato's Republic has become proverbial as a striking example of imaginary perfection, such as could exist only in the mind of an idle thinker, as Brucker thinks it ridiculous that Plato could have said that no prince could ever govern well unless he participated in his ideas. We should do better, however, to pursue this thought and endeavor, where that excellent philosopher leaves us without his guidance, to place it in clearer light by our own efforts, rather than to throw it aside as useless on the miserable and dangerous pretext of this impracticability. A constitution founded on the greatest human freedom, according to laws which ensure that the freedom of each can exist side by side with the freedom of others, without any regard to the greatest happiness, because that will surely follow by itself, is at least a necessary idea on which not only the first plan of the constitution of a state, but also all laws must be based. For at the beginning we must abstract from existing impediments. which may owe their origin not so much to human nature itself, as to the actual neglect of true ideas in the making of laws. For nothing can be more mischievous and more unworthy of a philosopher than the vulgar appeal to what is called adverse experience. Such experience would never have existed at all if at the proper time institutions had been framed according to those ideas, and not according to the crude concepts which, because they were derived merely from experience, have marred all good intentions. What? So everybody's intentions have always been good, it's just the execution that hasn't been terrific at all times? Meaning all governments and constitutions, I suppose, have the aim of maximizing freedom and equality, etc. But, yeah. Okay. And they had good intentions, but, it's fucked up. Alright. The more legislation and government are in harmony with that idea, the rarer, no doubt, punishments would become. This is a pretty rosy view of the world and human nature and, I don't know. Slavery, a lot of things come to mind as like, okay, right, whatever. And it is therefore quite reasonable to say, as Plato did, that in a perfect state no punishments at all would be required. Yeah, I suppose that's true. And although this perfect state may never be realized, the idea is quite correct, which sets up this maximum as an archetype in order to bring the legal constitutions of mankind closer and closer to the greatest possible perfection. For what the highest degree at which mankind must stop may be, and how wide the chasm may be that necessarily remains between the idea and its realization, is something that no one can or ought to determine. Because it is this very freedom that may be able to go beyond any limits hitherto assigned to it. It is not only, however, where human reason asserts its genuine causality, and where ideas become operative causes, with regard to actions and their objects, that is to say, in the moral sphere, but also in nature itself, that Plato rightly discerns clear proofs of its origin from ideas. A plant, an animal, the regular arrangement of the cosmos, most likely therefore the whole order of nature, show clearly that they are possible only according to ideas. Okay. And they show that although no single creature, under the individual conditions of its existence, is congruent with the idea. And they show that although no single creature, under the individual conditions of its existence, is congruent with the idea of what is most perfect of its kind, as little as any human being is congruent to the idea of humanity, which, for all that, he carries in his soul as the archetype of all his actions. Yet, in the highest understanding, those ideas are individual, unchangeable, thoroughly determined, and are in fact the original causes of things. And it can only be said of the whole of things combined in the universe that it is perfectly adequate to the idea. If we were to take away Plato's exaggerated expression, then the philosopher's spiritual effort of ascending from the merely reproductive observation of what is physical in the order of the world to the architectonic connection of this order according to ends, that is, according to ideas, becomes an enterprise that deserves respect and imitation. I'm a little surprised by this. I'm sorry, I'm gathering my thoughts for a second. And sometimes I'm just out of breath when I'm reading on this. I don't know why. But I suppose if you asked me, I hadn't really thought about Plato in relation to Kant until now. But like, if you asked me based on Kant's like the previous parts of the critique, especially in the dialectic. Do you think Kant's a fan of Plato? I'd probably say I don't think so. In particular, the forms too, because wouldn't the forms for Kant be something beyond the scope of reason, like the Platonic form of a good constitution, or like government, or freedom, or what do you say, virtue, which I think is what he's getting at. Like, it's great to aspire to it, maybe, or like whatever, like practically, but like I would think that Kant's response to that would be like, that's something beyond what we can actually know and what reason can get us, and therefore it is like kind of the entire point of the dialectic to point these things out, that we shouldn't be trying to get reason to do that because it's not possible. So yeah, I'm a little surprised by this, and I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm interested to see how he connects this to the Plato, to the dialectic. It seems weird and like a not great match. Anyway, but with regard to the principles of morality, legislation, and religion, where the ideas make experience itself of the good possible in the first place, though they can never be fully expressed in experience, such efforts are of very eminent merit. Okay. Only those fail to recognize this merit who attempt to judge it according to empirical rules. Is that what I'm doing? The very validity of which as principles has been cancelled out by the ideas. For with regard to nature, it is indeed experience which supplies us with the rule and is the source of truth. With regard to moral laws, however, experience is, alas, but the mother of illusion, and it is altogether reprehensible either to derive or to try to limit the laws of what we ought to do from what is done. Okay, sorry, I'm going to reread that. For with regard to nature, it is indeed experience which supplies us with the rule and is the source of truth. With regard to moral laws, however, experience is, alas, but the mother of illusion. So what actually happens related to moral laws is an illusion, and is altogether reprehensible either to derive or try to limit the laws of what we ought to do from what is done. So, like, saying that morals is kind of, based on experience, and therefore you can derive morals from experience, implying, well, if it happened in the past, it's okay to happen now, or because that happened, I can do this. That's not really how morals work. They're not based on experience. There must be some higher love, as Steve Winwood would say. Okay. Instead of all these observations, the full execution of which indeed constitutes the peculiar dignity of philosophy, we have to occupy ourselves at present with a less resplendent, though not less meritorious task, namely that of leveling and strengthening the foundation of those majestic moral edifices. Sounds awesome. For this foundation is at present undermined by all sorts of mole tracks, which are the work of reason, vainly but confidently searching for buried treasure, and which render that building insecure. It is now our duty. I was not expecting this in the dialect. This is morals? What? Okay. It is now our duty to acquire an accurate knowledge of the transcendental use of pure reason, its principles and ideas, in order that we may correctly determine and estimate the influence and value of pure reason. But before I leave this preliminary introduction, I beg those who really care for philosophy, which means more than is commonly supposed, if they are convinced by what I have said, and have yet to say, to take the term idea in its original meaning under their special protection, so that it should no longer be lost among other expressions by which all sorts of other representations are loosely designated, to the great detriment of science. There is no lack of names adequate to express each kind of representation, without our having to encroach upon the property of another kind. I shall here give a serial list of them. That would be helpful, because I don't know what the hell you talking. I don't know. I don't really understand this. The linguistic aspect of this. Like, why are you so worried about using idea in the correct way and not using idea in a different way? The genus is representation in general. Under it stands representation with consciousness, a perception referring solely to the subject as a modification of its state, its sensation, while an objective sensation is knowledge. Knowledge is either an intuition or a concept. The former refers immediately to an object, meaning intuition, and is singular. The latter, meaning a concept, refers mediately to the object, that is, by means of a characteristic mark that several things can have in common. A concept is either empirical or a pure concept. A concept is either an empirical or pure concept, and the pure concept, insofar as it has its origin solely in the understanding, not in the pure image of sensibility, is called notion. A concept formed of notions and transcending the possibility of experience is an idea. Okay. A concept formed of notions and transcending the possibility of experience is an idea, or a concept of reason. To anyone who has once become accustomed to these distinctions, it must be extremely irksome to hear the representation of the color red be called an idea. It is not even rightly to be called a notion. Okay, I want to run through this again. Okay. So we're starting with, I shall here give a serial list of them. So we have the genus is representation in general. So representations are first. Under it stands representation with consciousness, perception. A perception referring solely to the subject as a modification of its state is sensation, while an objective sensation is knowledge. Okay. Knowledge is either an intuition or a concept. So, okay. So we're in knowledge, and then we have an intuition or a concept. An intuition refers immediately to an object and is singular, right? That's through experience. The latter, a concept, refers mediately to the object, right? Because it doesn't have one. It's referring to something. It's a symbol. That is, by means of a characteristic mark that several things have in common. Okay. And then we have a concept is either empirical, so based on experience, or a pure concept, so not based on experience. And the pure concept, insofar as it has its origin solely in the understanding, not in the pure image of sensibility, is called notion. So a concept that is like purely in the understanding and not based on an image related to sensibility, okay, is called a notion. And the concept formed of notions and transcending the possibility of experience is an idea. Okay. Not really sure what to do with that, but all right, let's keep going. I guess we'll see. Transcendental Dialectic, Book 1, Section 2. We had an instance in our transcendental analytic of how the mere logical form of our knowledge could contain the origin of pure a priori concepts, which represent objects antecedently to all experience. Gotta start over. I'm going to start over because we had an instance in our transcendental analytic of how the mere logical form of our knowledge could contain the origin of pure a priori concepts, which represent objects antecedently to all experience. But that wasn't possible, was it? Or rather, indicate the synthetic unity by which alone an empirical knowledge of objects becomes possible. There's a cat right in my face. Hi, cat. Come here, birdie. Come on. Come on. No, don't turn the page. You want to say something? Sorry. Or rather, indicate the synthetic unity by which alone an empirical knowledge of objects becomes possible. The form of judgments, changed into a concept of the synthesis of intuitions, gave us the categories that govern. The form of judgments, changed into a concept of the synthesis of intuitions, gave us the categories that govern all use of the understanding in experience. We may expect therefore, that the form of the syllogisms of reason, when applied to the synthetic unity of intuitions according to the categories, will contain the origin of special a priori concepts, to be called pure concepts of reason or transcendental ideas, which ought to determine, according to principles, the use of the understanding within the whole realm of experience. What the fuck? What? Man. Okay. I'm going to have to read this whole paragraph again. Sorry. There's like a cat in my face and sorry. And I'm just like, this is just loaded up with so many different buzzwords that are specific to Kant. It's just, okay. Okay. So we had an instance in our transcendental analytic of how the mere logical form of our knowledge, so meaning knowledge based on reason and using the logical form of reason, presumably, could contain the origin of pure a priori concepts. So whether we could just logic our way to pure a priori concepts, which represents objects, which I didn't think that was possible, like objects in the world, from just the logical form of concepts used in reasoning, which represent objects antecedently to all experience. Again, I don't think that's possible. Or rather, indicate the synthetic unity by which alone an empirical knowledge of objects becomes possible. But the synthetic unity I thought was based on experience, so okay. The form of judgments, right, changed into a concept of the synthesis of intuitions. What does that mean? The form of judgments changed into a concept of the synthesis of intuitions gave us the categories that govern all use of the understanding in experience. Okay, so we got the categories which govern, and is used for, things are funneled through the categories, and then we have the apperception, unity of apperception, and then we are able to order, comprehend, understand our experience. We may expect, therefore, that the form of syllogisms of reason, when applied to the synthetic unity of intuitions according to the categories, will contain the origin of special a priori concepts. So if we were to use the form, meaning like the, proposition, subproposition, whatever it is, like conclusion. I know that's not correct, but like generally speaking, if we were to use that form of reason and apply it to the synthetic unity of intuitions, meaning our synthesized experience run through the understandings according to the categories, that somehow will contain the origin of special a priori concepts, meaning we can use that to understand certain things about the world, certain or create certain concepts prior to experience. To be called pure concepts of reason or transcendental ideas, which ought to determine, according to principles, the use of the understanding within the whole realm of experience. Okay, that sounds kind of wild, but let's keep going. The function of reason in its inferences, or syllogism, consists in the universality of knowledge according to concepts, and the syllogism itself is in reality a judgment determined a priori in the whole range of its condition. The proposition, Caius is mortal, might be taken from experience by means of the understanding alone. But what we want is a concept, here the concept of a human being, containing the condition under which the predicate, that is, assertion in general, of this judgment is given. And after I have subsumed the predicate under this condition, taken in its whole, all human beings are mortal, I proceed in accordance with this to determine the knowledge of my object. Caius is mortal. Okay. What we are doing then, in the conclusion of a syllogism, is to restrict the predicate to a certain object. Yes? Because we're asking as Caius specifically. After we have thought it in the first major premise in its whole range under a certain condition. This complete magnitude of its range in reference to such a condition is called universality. And to this corresponds in the synthesis of intuition, the allness or totality of conditions. The transcendental concept of reason. Therefore, none but the concept of the totality of conditions of a given conditioned. The transcendental concept of reason. Again, he just says this shit, and I'm like, what? Am I supposed to know what that is? Like, I guess he's telling me, but like, the transcendental concept of reason reason considered transcendentally is none but the concept of the totality of conditions of a given conditioned. As, therefore, the unconditioned alone renders the totality of conditions possible. Okay, meaning an unconditioned is like all possibilities, and it renders the totality of conditions possible. And as, conversely, the total of conditions must always itself be unconditioned, right? It follows that a pure concept of reason in general can be explained as the concept of the unconditioned. The pure concept of reason in general can be explained as the concept of the unconditioned, insofar as this concept remains a basis for the synthesis of the conditioned. Okay, so meaning the whole field of possibilities, unconditioned reality, like possibilities of reality, can remain the baseline as long as at some point there is a synthesis that happens and we figure out whether Caius is mortal or not mortal. In other words, we synthesize it and figure out what the conditioned, specific, set of circumstances is. Oh man, there's got to be an easier way to say this. We will find as many pure concepts of reason as there are kinds of relations, which the understanding represents to itself by means of the categories. And we will have to look for an unconditioned, firstly, of the categorical synthesis in a subject. Secondly, of the hypothetical synthesis of the member of a series, like mortals and whether or not they're, humans and whether or not they're, whether humans generally are mortal. Sorry, took me a while to get there. I got there. Thirdly, is the disjunctive synthesis of the parts of a system. Okay. There are exactly as many kinds of syllogisms, each of which advances by means of prosyllogisms to the unconditioned. And I think prosyllogisms here means like step-by-step type of thing. The first advances to the subject, which itself is no longer a predicate. The second, to the presupposition, which presupposes nothing else. The third, to an aggregate of the members of a division, which require nothing else in order to complete the division of the concept. Hence, the pure concepts of reason, of totality, in the synthesis of conditions are necessary and grounded in the nature of human reason. Grounded in the nature of, at least as tasks, in order to expand the unity of the understanding up to the unconditioned, if that is possible, even though these transcendental concepts may otherwise be without any proper use in concreto, and thus have no benefit beyond setting the understanding in a direction wherein its use, being expanded as far as possible, is at the same time brought into thoroughgoing harmony with itself. Okay, so we're going to have subjects, predicates, limitations, whatever, and they might not be helpful in the real world, but they are going to kind of provide us with logic and understanding and ideas and a bunch of other shit, probably. Harmony. While speaking here of the totality of conditions and of the unconditioned as the common title of all the concepts of reason, we again meet with a term which we cannot do without, but with which, by long abuse, has become so equivocal that we cannot employ it with safety. The term absolute is one of those few words which, in their original meaning, were adapted to a concept for which there is no other word of the same language that fits it exactly. Absolute? Okay. And the loss of this word, or what is the same, the looseness in its use, entails also the loss of the concept itself. And since, moreover, it is the loss of a concept with which reason is constantly occupied, we cannot dispense with it without serious damage to all transcendental investigations. At present, The term absolute is frequently used simply in order to indicate that something applies to a thing considered in itself, and thus applies to it internally. In this sense, absolutely possible would mean that which is possible in itself. Okay? Which in fact is the least that could be said of an object. The term is sometimes used also to indicate that something, for instance absolute sovereignty, is valid in any relation, that is, without limitation. In this sense, absolutely possible would mean that which is possible in all respects, in any relation. And this is again the most that can be said of the possibility of a thing. It is true that these two meanings sometimes coincide, because something that is internally impossible is impossible also in any relation, and therefore absolutely. But in most cases they are infinitely far apart, and I am by no means justified in inferring that because something is possible in itself, it is possible also in any relation, that is, absolutely. Nay, with regard to absolute necessity, I shall be able to show later that it by no means always depends on inner necessity, and that the two cannot therefore be considered synonymous. Okay? No doubt. I need some coffee. Excuse me. No doubt, if the opposite of a thing is internally impossible, then this opposite is also impossible in every respect, and the thing itself is therefore absolutely necessary. So in both ways, right? Or both meanings. But I cannot infer conversely that the opposite of what is absolutely necessary is internally impossible. That is, that the absolute necessity of things is the same as an inner necessity. For in certain cases the expression of inner necessity is an entirely empty expression with which we cannot connect the least concept, whereas the concept of the necessity of a thing in any relation, with regard to everything possible, implies very special determinations. As therefore the loss of a concept, which is of great importance in speculative philosophy, can never be the matter of indifference to philosophers, I hope they will also not be indifferent to the determination and careful preservation of the term to which the concept adheres. I shall therefore use the term absolute, thank you for finally getting to the point, in this wider meaning, in opposition to that which is valid only comparatively or in particular respects. I shall therefore use the term absolute in this wider meaning, in opposition to that which is valid only comparatively or in particular respects, for the latter is restricted to conditions, while the absolute is free from any restrictions whatsoever. Okay. Can you use it in a sentence now? Related to transcendental dialectic. Now the transcendental concept of reason always aims at the absolute totality in the synthesis of conditions, and does not end until it has reached that which is unconditioned absolutely. There we go. That is, in any relation. Okay. The transcendental concept of reason. Okay. Aims at the absolute totality in the synthesis of conditions. It does not end until it has reached that which is unconditioned, absolutely, that is, in any relation. For pure reason leaves everything to the understanding, which initially refers to the objects of intuition, or rather their synthesis in imagination. For pure reason leaves everything to the understanding, which initially refers to objects of intuition, or rather their synthesis in imagination. Okay. It is only the absolute totality in the use of the concepts of the understanding that reason reserves for itself, while trying to carry the synthetic unity which is thought in the category up to the absolutely unconditioned. Okay. So pure reason uses, like, effectively, reason and understanding. Did I say reason? So I think what he's trying to say is, like, pure reason uses, like, ideas. Well, I shouldn't use the word ideas. You're going to scream at me. But, like, the abstract, more intellectual side of things in order to figure out, like, what is possible and what is unconditioned. And then it refers to the synthesis, which I assume he's using as as a proxy for intuition, like sense data, to then figure out the conditioned and whether or not, like, what of the unconditioned actually applies and is therefore conditioned in the specific set of circumstances. Okay. I think, maybe, who knows. With regard to appearances, we may therefore call the latter unity, the unity of reason, and the former unity, which is expressed by the category, the unity of understanding. Hence, reason refers only to the use of the understanding, but not insofar as the latter contains the basis of possible experience. For the absolute totality of conditions is not a concept that can be used in experience, because no experience is unconditioned. Right. But in order to prescribe to it a direction towards a certain unity, a unity of which the understanding knows nothing, and which is meant to comprehend all acts of the understanding with regard to any object, into an absolute whole. So it's trying to define the absolute possibility, unconditioned possibilities of everything, without necessarily referencing specific experience, or experience at all, really. On this account, the objective use of the pure concepts of reason is always transcendent, while that of the pure concepts of the understanding is always immanent, because it is restricted to possible experience alone. By idea, I understand a necessary concept of reason to which the senses can supply no congruent object. Necessary concept of reason to which the senses can supply no congruent object. That's an idea. Because remember, it's a notion, it's not based on, like, the experience at all. The concepts of reason, therefore, of which we have been speaking, are transcendental ideas. They are concepts of pure reason insofar as they consider all empirical knowledge as determined by an absolute totality of conditions. Okay, by idea I understand a necessary concept of reason, to which the senses can supply no congruent object. Congruent meaning, like, absolutely matching. I don't think it's just hypothetical. The concepts of reason, therefore, of which we have been speaking, are transcendental ideas. They are concepts of pure reason, insofar as they consider all empirical knowledge as determined by an absolute totality of conditions. Right, and they're not talking about any specific experience. It's an idea. They are not mere fancies, but are imposed by the very nature of reason itself. Right, we're still using, like reason and logic and stuff, and therefore refer by necessity to the whole use of the understanding. They are lastly transcendent and overstep the limits of all experience. No object can ever be given an experience that would be adequate to the transcendental idea. If we speak of an idea, we say a great deal with respect to the object, as the object of pure understanding. But for this very reason, we say very little with respect to the subject, that is, with respect to its actuality under empirical conditions. Right. For an idea, being the concept of a maximum, that's a good way to put it, can never be congruently given in concreto. Right. As the latter is really the whole aim in the merely speculative use of reason, and as approaching a concept which is yet never reached in practice, is the same as missing it altogether. People say of such a concept that it is only an idea. Thus one might say that the absolute whole of all appearances is only an idea. For as we can never sketch such a whole in an image, it remains a problem without a solution. In the practical use of the understanding, on the contrary, where we are only concerned with carrying something out according to rules, the idea of practical reason can always be actually given in concreto, right, in our actual life, although only in part. Nay, it is the indispensable condition of all practical use of reason. Carrying out this idea is always limited and deficient, but takes place under limits that cannot be determined, and therefore under the influence of the concept of an absolute completeness. Thus the practical idea is always truly fruitful, and is with regard to actual actions indispensable and necessary. Sorry. In the practical idea, pure reason even has a causality of actually bringing about what is contained in its concept. Hence, we cannot say of wisdom, contemptuously as it were, that it is only an idea. On the contrary, for the very reason that it contains the idea of the necessary unity of all possible ends, it must, as an original and at least limiting condition, serve as a rule for everything practical. Although we must say of all transcendental concepts of reason that they are only ideas, they are not therefore to be considered as superfluous and useless. Okay. For although we cannot determine any object through them, they may nevertheless fundamentally, even if unobserved, serve the understanding as a canon for its extended and consistent use. Although through such a use, the understanding does not know any object better than it would according to its own concepts, it is guided better and led further by it in this knowledge, not to mention the fact that these transcendental concepts of reason may perhaps render possible a transition from concepts of nature to practical concepts, and thus impart to the moral ideas themselves a certain strength and connection with speculative knowledge of reason. More light will be thrown on all this in the sequel. It's the next book, I assume. For our present purposes, we are obliged to set aside a consideration of these practical ideas, and to treat of reason only in its speculative use, and within this, in a still more limited way, namely, only in its transcendental use. Here we must follow the same road which we took before the deduction of the categories. That is, we must consider the logical form of all rational knowledge, and see whether perhaps through this logical form, reason may not likewise become a source of concepts, which enable us to regard objects in themselves as determined synthetically a priori with respect to one or another function of reason. Reason, if considered as a faculty of a certain logical form of knowledge, is the faculty of inferring, that is, of judging immediately, that's reason, by subsuming the condition of a possible judgment under the condition of a given judgment. Okay, subsuming the condition of a possible judgment under the condition of a given judgment. The given judgment is the universal rule. The given judgment is the universal rule, major premise, etc. Subsuming the condition of another possible judgment under the condition of the rule is the minor premise. You got a major, then a minor. The actual judgment, which contains the assertion of the rule in the subsumed case, is the conclusion. So major, minor, conclusion. We know that the rule asserts something universally under a certain condition. The condition of the rule is then found to take place in a given case. Hence, that which was universally valid under that condition is considered as valid also in this given case, which carries with it this condition. It is easy to see, therefore, that reason arrives at knowledge by means of acts of the understanding. It's easy to see that reason arrives at knowledge by means of acts of the understanding, which constitute a series of conditions. If I arrive at the proposition that all bodies are alterable only by starting from a more remote knowledge, which does not yet contain the concept of body, but only the condition of such a concept, namely, everything composite is alterable, and I then proceed to a less remote knowledge, which stands under the condition of the former knowledge, namely, bodies are composite, and lastly, I advance to the third proposition, which connects the more remote knowledge, alterable, with the knowledge before me. Therefore, bodies are alterable. When I see that I have passed through a series of conditions, premises, before I arrived at my knowledge, a conclusion. Every series, the exponent of which is given as that of a categorical or hypothetical judgment, can be continued, so that this same act of reason leads to ratiocinatio polysogilistica, a series of inferences which, either on the side of the conditions or of the conditioned, may be continued indefinitely. Okay. It is soon perceived, however, that the chain or series of prosyllogisms, that is, of inferred knowledge on the side of the grounds or conditions of a given knowledge, in other words, the ascending series of syllogisms must stand in a very different relation to the faculty of reason from that of the descending series, that is, of the progress on the side of the conditioned means of episyllogisms. Okay. The ascending series of syllogisms must stand in a very different relation to the faculty of reason from that of the descending series, that is, of the progress of reason on the side of the conditioned by means of episyllogisms. For as the former case the knowledge is given only as conditioned, it is impossible to arrive at it by means of reason in any other way by presupposing at least that all the members of the series on the side of the conditions are given. totality in the series of premises, because it is only on this presupposition that the judgment before us is possible a priori. Because it is only on this presupposition that the judgment is possible a priori. Whereas on the side of the conditioned, or of the conclusions, we only think a series in the process of becoming, not one presupposed as complete or given. That is, we think only of potential progress. Hence, if our knowledge is considered as conditioned, then reason is constrained to look upon the series of conditions in the ascending line as complete and given in its totality. But if the same knowledge is looked upon simultaneously as a condition of other kinds of knowledge, that's my stomach. I don't know if you can hear that. Whoops. Turn back. Oh, no. But if the same knowledge is looked upon simultaneously as a condition of other kinds of knowledge, which constitute among themselves a series of conclusions in a descending line, then reason can be quite different as to how far that progress may go a parte posteriori, and whether a totality of this series is possible at all. So that one would not extend forever. For reason does not require such a series for the conclusion at hand, because this conclusion is already sufficiently determined and secured by its grounds a parte priori. Whether the series of premises on the side of the conditions has a first member as the supreme condition, or whether it has no such member and is therefore without limits a parte priori, it must at all events contain a totality of conditions, even though we should never succeed in comprehending this totality. And the entire series must be unconditionally true if the conditioned, which is considered as a conclusion resulting from it, is to be accepted as true. This is a demand of reason, which proclaims its knowledge as determined a priori and necessary, either in itself, and in this case it requires no grounds, or, if it is derivative as a member in a series of grounds, that is itself unconditionally true. I don't... Oh yeah, this is section 3. Okay, section 3. Transcendental Dialectic, Book 1, Section 3. System of Transcendental Ideas. I need a new highlighter. This one's getting weak. I just highlight everything. It's not very helpful. We are not at present concerned with logical dialectic, which abstracts from all content of knowledge and lays bare solely illusions in the form of syllogisms, but with a transcendental dialectic, which is supposed to contain entirely a priori the origin of certain kinds of knowledge arising from pure reason, and of certain inferred concepts, the object of which can never be given empirically, and which therefore lie entirely outside the domain of the faculty of the pure understanding. We gathered from the natural relation which must exist between the transcendental and the logical use of our knowledge, in inferences as well as in judgments, that there must be three kinds of dialectical inference, and no more, referring to the three kinds of inference by which reason may from principles arrive at knowledge. By which reason may from inference arrive at knowledge. Can you say them again, please? And we gathered that in all of these, it is the task of reason to ascend from conditioned synthesis, to which the understanding is always restricted, to the unconditioned synthesis, which the understanding can never reach. The universal in all relations that our representations can have is 1. Their relation to the subject, 2. Their relation to objects, either as appearances or as objects of thought in general. If we combine this subdivision with the above division, we see that all relation of representations of which we can form either a concept or an idea is threefold. 1. The relation of the subject. 2. The relation to the manifold of the object in appearance. 3. The relation to all things in general. Okay? All pure concepts in general aim at a synthetic unity of representations, while concepts of pure reason, transcendental ideas, aim at unconditioned synthetic unity of all conditions in general. Okay. All pure concepts in general aim at a synthetic unity of representations. Okay. While concepts of pure reason, transcendental ideas, aim at unconditioned synthetic unity of all conditions in general. Okay. We've been talking about that. All transcendental ideas, therefore, can be arranged in three classes. The first, containing the absolute, unconditioned unity of the thinking subject. Second, the absolute unity of the series of conditions of appearances. Third, the absolute unity of the condition of all objects of thought in general. Okay, so hold on. First is the absolute, unconditioned unity of the thinking subject. That's like the unity of apperception, it sounds like. 2, the absolute unity of a series of conditions of appearances. So, our experience of the world, like conditions of appearances, serially. Okay. Third, the absolute unity of the condition of all objects of thought in general. So not objects in the world, but objects of thought in general. That would be the unconditioned kind of concepts that we've been talking about, I would think. In a way, at least. Maybe not exactly. The thinking subject is the object of psychology. The sum total of all appearances, the world, is the object of cosmology. And a thing which contains the supreme condition of the possible of all that can be thought, the being of all things, is the object of theology. Smart. So the unity of the thinking subject would be psychology, obviously. The sum total of all appearances, it's like essentially existence and stuff, is cosmology. And the unity of the condition of all objects of thought in general, the being of all beings, is the object of theology. Interesting. Thus it is pure reason which supplies the idea of a transcendental science of the soul, of a transcendental science of the world, and, lastly, of a transcendental knowledge of God. Even the mere sketch of any one of these three sciences does not come from the understanding, even if combined with the highest logical use of reason, that is, with all conceivable inferences leading from one object of the understanding, appearance, to all the others, and on the most remote members of the empirical synthesis. Even such a sketch is solely a pure and genuine product, or rather problem, of pure reason. Which modes of pure concepts of reason come under these three headings of all transcendental ideas will be fully explained in the following chapter. They follow the thread of the categories for pure reason. They follow the thread of the categories. For pure reason never refers directly to objects, but only to the concepts of objects framed by the understanding. Sorry, I gotta highlight that. They follow the threads of the categories. For pure reason never refers directly to objects, right, because it's pure reason, but only to the concepts of objects framed by the understanding. Nor can it be rendered clear, except hereafter in a detailed explanation, how reason, merely by the synthetic use of the same function which it employs for the categorical syllogism, is necessarily led on to the concept of the absolute unity of the thinking subject. How the logical procedure of reason in hypothetical syllogisms must necessarily lead to the idea of the absolutely unconditioned in a series of given conditions, and how, finally, the mere form of the disjunctive syllogism must necessarily produce the highest concept of reason, that of a being of all beings, a thought which at first seems extremely paradoxical. No objective deduction, like that given of the categories, is possible of these transcendental ideas. For as they are only ideas, they have no relation to any object that could be given congruently with them. Right? What we were able to undertake, however, was a subjective derivation of them from the nature of reason, and this has been given in the present chapter. Whew, this has been rough. We can easily see that pure reason has no other aim but the absolute totality of synthesis on the side of the conditions, whether inherence, dependence, or concurrence, and that it is not concerned with the absolute completeness on the side of the conditioned. It is only the former which is required by pure reason for presupposing the entire series of conditions and for thus presupposing a priori to the understanding. However, once we have a given condition completely and unconditionally, no concept of reason is required any longer to continue the series. For the understanding by itself takes every step downward from the condition to the conditioned. The transcendental ideas, therefore, serve only for ascending in the series of conditions up to the unconditioned, that is, to the principles. Okay. With regard to the descending to the conditioned, right. So you, okay, it's starting to make a little more. So you ascend, so you have these effectively you abstract and ascend and go up until you get to what I guess Kant would say would be the idea and the unconditioned. And then you have this generality that's completely universal and totally abstracted from any actual objects in the world or experiences or things or whatever. And then the syllogism somehow, I'm not sure I understand which is ascending, which is descending, but I guess I'm getting that now. So one of the syllogisms allows you to abstract, like I just said. And then the other form of syllogism allows you to descend to more particular things and figure out whether or not you can actually eventually probably land on an object or an experience in the world that corresponds to that and tells you whether or not that particular concept that you have descended down to is true or false or consistent with the world or, I don't know, illogical in the real world or something else. Okay, with regard to descending to the conditioned, there is no doubt a very extensive logical use for which our reason makes of the laws of the understanding, but no transcendental use whatsoever. And if we form an idea of the absolute totality of such a synthesis of the progress, as for instance of the entire series of all future alterations in the world, then this is only a creation of thought, right? Which may be thought if we like, but is not presupposed necessarily by reason. For the possibility of the conditioned indeed presupposes the totality of its conditions, but not of its consequences. Such a concept, therefore, is not one of the transcendental ideas with which alone we have to deal here. Finally, we can also perceive that there is among the transcendental ideas themselves a certain coherence and unity, and that by means of these ideas pure reason brings all its knowledge into one system. There is in the progress from our knowledge of ourselves, the soul, to a knowledge of the world, and by means of this to a knowledge of the original being, something so natural it looks like the logical progress of reason from premises to a conclusion. Whether there exists here a real, though hidden relationship, such as we saw before, between the logical and transcendental procedures, is also one of the questions the answer to which can only be given in the progress of these investigations. We have for the moment achieved what we wish to achieve. For in treating the transcendental concepts of reason, the systems of other philosophers generally mix them up with other concepts, without distinguishing them even from the concepts of the understanding. But we were able to move them away from so equivocal a position, to determine their origin, and thereby at the same time their number, to which no further ones can be added, and to present them in a systematic coherence whereby a special field is marked out and enclosed for pure reason. Okay, I started to get that more toward the end. I probably need to reread that and could probably stand to read some secondary materials related to that specifically. But yeah, okay. Made it through another section at page 314. We currently have 350 pages left, so we're approaching the halfway point. We might be more than halfway, based on I don't know. Doesn't really matter, because it looks like there's some negative space on these pages, like they're whatever. Doesn't matter. But yeah, the next is Transcendental Dialectic Book 2, which my understanding is significantly longer. That we just read the entirety of Book 1, on the dialectical inferences of pure reason. And so yeah, we'll do that next.